The Coffee Hour. Welcome to Coffee with our morning host. We broadcast a host of programs like current topics, newspaper headlines, and music on Radio Sri Lanka. Tune in every weekday from 7 to 8 a.m. The Coffee Hour. Welcome to Coffee with our morning host. We broadcast a host of programs like current topics, newspaper headlines, and music on Radio Sri Lanka. Tune in every weekday from 7 to 8 a.m.
You are with Radio Sri Lanka on 97.4 and 97.6 FM island-wide, and welcome to your all listeners on www.sobc.lk as well. So, in fact, for today's Coffee Hour program, we have a very prominent and well-recognized personality. So, this is going to be quite interesting, I might say. Well, without further ado, let's all welcome Reverend Thera Ajahn Rakmali. A very warm welcome to you, and a very good morning to you as well.
Good morning, and thank you for your welcome.
So, if I would brief to you about this Reverend Thera Ajahn Rakmali, who was born in Norway in 1964, and he first became interested in Buddhism and meditation in his early 20s after a visit to Japan. And having completed degrees in both engineering and finance, he began his monastic training as an anagarika in England at Amaravati and Shithurst Buddhist Monastery. So, without further ado, let me start off with the questions. So, Reverend Thera, given your experience living in both Western and Eastern cultures, how do you see Buddhist teachings adapting to different cultural contexts, particularly in a country like Sri Lanka with a long Theravada tradition?
Yeah, one of the interesting things about Buddhism is precisely this adaptation to new cultures all the time. And you see that throughout Buddhist history. When Buddhism moved from the homeland of India, it came first to Sri Lanka, then it moved into Central Asia, it moved into China. And wherever it went, there were new kind of shapes and forms of Buddhism. Like, for example, the stupas of India, they become pagodas in China. The way we dress as monastics look very different in East Asia than they look in South Asia, including Sri Lanka. So it's always changing, it's always adopting. So the significant thing about Buddhism is the idea of remembering the core teachings of the Buddha. That is what is important. And as long as we keep those core teachings and also the correct way of practicing according to monastics, as long as we have that, then we have the Dhamma of the Buddha, and that is what is important. Whereas the external forms can always change around, and that doesn't really matter so much. And so, for example, if you take the West compared to Sri Lanka, you will see that in the Western world, we do kind of rituals slightly differently, right? We have different kind of buildings, perhaps, and these things. And then when I come to Sri Lanka, I see more the traditional kind of way of doing things. And sometimes I feel that Sri Lanka is a bit like you are stuck a little bit in time. It's a bit like going back to the time of the Buddha. And this is such a beautiful thing, if you are a Buddhist monastic, moving closer to the Buddha, feeling that you are in a Buddhist society. So I love being in Sri Lanka for these reasons, and it's very, very delightful to be here.
Yes, so that's really nice to hear. And also, as I mentioned earlier, you began this monastic training as an anagarika by keeping the 8 precepts in England at Amaravati and Shithurst Buddhist Monastery. So, Reverend Thera, many people are interested in Buddhism but find meditation challenging, as I would say. So, what advice would you give to a beginner who wants to develop a strong meditation practice?
Okay, so the most important thing about meditation is just to learn to relax. Most people are far too concerned about watching the breath or doing kind of metta, Maitri meditation, these things straight away. But the beginning of meditation should just be to learn to relax, When you close your eyes and you kind of lean back against the wall or sit on a chair or whatever, First of all, it doesn't matter how you sit. Don't have to sit with a cross-legged. Don't need the full lotus posture or anything like that. So you just learn to be at ease and you relax. And when you really relax, when you have a bit of kindness towards yourself, metta towards yourself, and you can feel kind of, all the tensions of the week going, that is already a benefit of meditation.
Just a higher state of mind. You go without the physical crossing the legs and all that. It's about all mind.
It's all about mind, because the mind is tense, right, because of all the things that we do. So by relaxing the body, you're also relaxing the mind. And relaxing the mind is always the first step in meditation. And then as you start to relax, you bring in a bit of happiness. You feel the peace that is there. You feel the delight of having a relaxed body. Maybe you have a bit of, kind of spiritual priti, because of the Buddha, because of the Dhamma, because of all of these things, and you have an uplifted mind. And then when the mind is uplifted and you are really relaxing, then the sati, the mindfulness, becomes strong. And when the sati is established, then you can start watching the breath. But even if you never start watching the breath, if all you do is just kind of chillaxing, to use a modern term, and just to enjoy yourself, actually already gaining benefit from the meditation.
Yes, so I'd say it's all about relaxing your mind and gaining a higher state of mind after continuous meditation that you practice.
Yeah, but don't worry too much about the higher state of mind. Worry about relaxing, and then the state of mind comes by itself.
Yeah. So, Reverend Thera, what are some common misconceptions about Buddhism that you encounter, and how would you address them?
Okay, so number one is that people think that Buddhism is all about meditation practice, but there are things that are more important in Buddhism than meditation. And the most important thing is to be a kind person, to live a moral life, to follow the precepts, to treat other people well. This is the foundation of Buddhism. And if you don't do that properly, meditation is almost impossible. If you have to choose either a moral and kind life or meditation, you should choose morality every time, because it is more foundational. And then from that morality, then it can arise. This is the first kind of big misconception. There are a large number of misconceptions. Another one is the idea that Nibbana is some kind of place that you go when you die. Nibbana is not a place. Nibbana is the ending of suffering. It's the highest happiness. It's the ending of rebirth. And this is a really problematic thing, because this kind of wrong view, it makes Buddhism sound like it is some kind of heavenly realm or something like that, which it is not. Another very common perception is the idea that mindfulness is enough on the path. You are just mindful, and if you are mindful in the daily life as you walk about, then somehow that will bring about enlightenment. But Buddhism is far more than mindfulness. Mindfulness is the starting point often with meditation. Then you meditate, then you gain peace of mind, really powerful stillness, and from that, actually, that is where the awakening comes. So the mindfulness movement, which is kind of imported a bit from America these days, the whole world, California gets it first, then the whole rest of the world takes it from California, sort of thing. It is a very narrow form of Buddhism. It's not really Buddhist teachings. We need to take the whole Eightfold Path into account, including at the beginning all the morality, then the samadhi, the stillness through meditation. Then it becomes a complete path. So that is another kind of important misconception, I would say. Is that enough misconceptions?
Yes. So, as you cited earlier, Sri Lanka has a rich Buddhist heritage. Even though India, where Buddha was born in India, and his enlightenment and his passing away, all three of these happened in India, Sri Lanka becomes to be the place where it has a rich Buddhist heritage. So can you speak to how this heritage is reflected in the daily lives of Sri Lankans and the culture of the country?
Okay, I'm happy to do that. But actually, now that you say that, you reminded me of a very important misconception while you were saying that. And this is the misconception that you hear, that the Buddha was born in Sri Lanka. And some people say this, and it is just a complete distortion of history. And I think it's terrible that we are trying to live a religion where we don't want to be deluded, but we're allowing ourselves to be deluded about some of the most basic things. If you read the sutras, you read the word of the Buddha, everything happened in a fairly small area of India. He wasn't even in all of India. He was only in a small part of India. That's where he was. And the idea that he was born in Sri Lanka is just it's a sad state of modern affairs, not just in Sri Lanka, but around the world, where there's so much fake news and so much of this kind of stuff happening here. But back to your question about how the Buddhist heritage is reflected in Sri Lanka, there's a lot, yeah. Sometimes you're not aware of it, but many of the little things that you do in Sri Lanka come from that Buddhist heritage, yeah? Like the Anjali. The Anjali is a kind of ancient Indian tradition that goes back probably before the time of the Buddha, yeah? And this is taken from that Buddhist society, taken into Sri Lanka. People wearing white on the Uposatha, that goes back to the time of the Buddha. People were already wearing white in those days. The same kind of thing, yeah. The dress code of the monastics hasn't changed very much. It's a very kind of boring fashion. The fashion has stayed the same for 2,500 years. So monastics look the same pretty much then or now as they did then. Shaven head, of course. The Buddha looked like a monk. Yeah, this is kind of interesting. In the sutras, the Buddha has a bald head and he kind of has these kind of robes. When you travel, I love traveling around Sri Lanka a little bit. I've been to Anuradhapura, I've been to Polonnaruwa, to some of these great historical sites. And it's just beautiful to see everywhere is Buddhism, because this island is saturated with Buddhism. And they say wherever you dig a little bit in the ground, soon enough you find some kind of ancient Buddhist relic there, some cave or some inscription or something. And I've been to some of these beautiful lenas, the cave monasteries that we have here in Sri Lanka. And these lenas, they often have inscriptions on them, in ancient Sinhala, sometimes even in Pali, with Sinhala characters. And some of these are up to 2,000 years old. Yeah, it's kind of extraordinary to see these things. And you feel that you are steeped in this ancient culture. And you kind of get this feeling that some of the people who lived in these lenas, they would have been arahants. They would have been fully enlightened people, right? So you go in there, you sit there, you cross your leg, and you kind of have this sensation of being part of this ancient lineage. Yeah, it's kind of you feeling you're part of something greater. And this is kind of the problem, because I live now in Australia. I've been living in Australia for the past 30 years, even though I was born in Norway. And there you feel a bit like a fish out of water, You're kind of flapping around, not really knowing what you're doing. But here you feel part of the culture. And that's a very beautiful kind of feeling, actually.
So that was really, really great to hear as a Sri Lankan and as a Buddhist, of course. So there are many Theravada Buddhist monasteries in Sri Lanka, and how do these monasteries function and contribute to Sri Lankan society, as you think?
So there are different kinds of monasteries, in a sense, in a Buddhist society. There are like what you would call the city viharas, the city monasteries, like some very famous ones here in Colombo, like Vajirarama is kind of one of the very famous ones and has a very kind of proud heritage with very famous monks who lived there, all these things. And the city monasteries or the city temples, they have a function of giving bhanas, giving talks, dhamma talks to the people, and looking after them when they have difficulties, someone dies, and all of these kind of things, and they visit you in hospital, they do parita chanting, you invite them to the house, and they give you general advice on Buddhism. But then there is another part of Buddhist monasticism in Sri Lanka, and that is the forest monasteries. And I visited one of these forest monasteries just now, just a couple of days ago. We just come from the International Meditation Center close to Kandy. And in between there, we visited this beautiful little forest monastery, very simple monastery, right? Where monks live in little kutis, little huts in the forest, and they meditate and they practice pretty much according to the ancient way, the way it was at the time of the Buddha. And it's beautiful to see that.
In fact, leading a very simple life.
Very simple life. They're really, really simple. They go pindabat to the village in the morning. They get some rice, a little bit of curry, sometimes just a bit of chili or something like that. And then they go back and eat that to sustain on that, and then they meditate. And this meditation practice still happening in some of the forest monasteries here in Sri Lanka. A very large, famous forest monastery is now Ujena, close to Kurunegala, in the middle of the island, very famous. And of course, these places, they still create people who have really deep insight and a really deep understanding of Buddhism. And these are the places that actually perpetuate and carry on the Buddhist heritage in a very real way, because without that insight into the Buddhist teachings, actually after a while the teachings get lost. You need to have that understanding in your heart, and when it's in your heart, that is when you can spread it to other people, and other people will understand what is going on. It's good to read it in books, but it's much more powerful if it is inside of you.
Exactly. So, Reverend Thera, in your experience, are there any unique challenges or opportunities for practicing Buddhism in Sri Lanka compared to other countries?
There are certainly many great opportunities. The opportunity is that there is still a lot of forest in Sri Lanka. There's a lot of opportunity for seclusion, for getting away from the city and away from all the sensory realm, so to speak. So that is kind of one of the really wonderful things about Sri Lanka. If you look at some of the other Buddhist countries like Thailand, much more difficult to find this kind of seclusion that you find in Sri Lanka in the present day. So that is very, very nice to see. And I was very tempted to kind of just disappear into the jungle when I went to this forest monastery and not be seen again in Australia later on. But I couldn't really do that because there's just too many other things going on there. The challenge is always to kind of keep the Buddhist tradition going in a good way. One of the things I see in Sri Lanka sometimes are these kind of strange movements that come around and teach Dhamma in very unfortunate ways. One example is the idea that the Buddha was born in Sri Lanka. No, he was not born in Sri Lanka. The Buddha never visited Sri Lanka even. Even that is kind of a myth. The Buddha was only in a very small area. So these kind of challenges of being able to kind of follow and understand what true Buddhism is, that's always going to be a challenge. And one of the ways to do that is to go back to the word of the Buddha, read the word of the Buddha, and take that as the main refuge in Buddhism. Because the word of the Buddha, well, that is essentially what is the first and the purest form of Buddhism that we have. There's a tendency to use later texts, to listen too much to individual teachers, like me. Don't listen to me, So always the danger of listening to too many teachers or listening to the later literature that you find in Buddhism. But the core of Buddhism, for every Buddhist around the world, are the suttas of the Buddha, the word of the Buddha, Buddha Vajana. And there's only a fairly small amount of the Pali texts that actually are the suttas. And that is a challenge to go back to those and use those in the right way. And when we do that, then we can keep Buddhism reasonably pure. So those are some of the universal challenges. Another challenge, which to me has been very significant, is to re-establish the idea of Buddhist nuns in the world. And I looked around in Sri Lanka when I was here. I was just leading a retreat, and there was quite a few monks and nuns coming to this retreat. And so I got a chance to speak to the nuns and ask them what their situation is like. And it's actually quite difficult. And I felt a bit sad when I saw how difficult it is for nuns to actually prosper properly, to be able to live the Dhamma properly. But I think it is in everyone's, to our advantage, whether we are male or female, to have a strong community of nuns. Because they can also become good teachers down the track. They can practice well. They can become enlightened just like the monks can. And we are doubling our chances when we have good nuns and good monks coming together. So I'm hoping that Sri Lanka is able to have a proper order of nuns in the future that can balance out with the monks. That's a great challenge, and I'm hoping that that will happen in the future.
Yes, so Reverend Thera, having lived in Australia for many years, if I'm not mistaken, it's 30?
It's 30 years.
30 years.
Yeah.
So do you find yourself incorporating any Sri Lankan Buddhist traditions into your practice at Bodhiana Monastery?
Our monastery in Perth, in Australia, is like an international monastery. So the people we have a large community of Sri Lankans, or used to be Sri Lankans, now they're kind of half Sri Lankan, half Australians. It's hard to say what people are after a while. But Sri Lankan background people, a large community of that in Perth, and many of them support our monastery. But we also have lots of Thai people. Lots of Thai people in Perth, they also support our monastery. We have lots of Chinese people in Perth, Chinese background from Singapore and Malaysia, mainland China. They support our monastery. We have people from Cambodia supporting our monastery, people from Vietnam supporting our monastery. We have ordinary kind of traditional Australians supporting our monastery. So it is like everyone. And so because of that, we tend to make it more universal. We tend to focus on the core things of Buddhism rather than following any one particular tradition. But, of course, we do sometimes have, for example, some of the Buddha statues we have are Sri Lankan-style Buddha statues, because we have Buddha statues from everywhere. Yes, this is one of the things that we do. Are there any other specific Sri Lankan things? There probably are, but I'm not sure what they are right now, sorry. but anyway, yeah.
The food culture, but the monks, if you could describe them.
Okay, so if you want to come to a good restaurant in Perth, come to Bodhidharma Monastery, or the best restaurant in Perth. We get Sri Lankan food, we get Thai food, we get Chinese food, we get Western food, we get the whole kind of gamut of food in that
Quite
monastery.
interesting.
Yeah. So I actually eat Sri Lankan food regularly in Perth. I sometimes think I was a Sri Lankan in the past life, because I kind of like Sri Lankan food, you know? So I think that's quite likely. Yes.
So, since we were talking about Buddhism all this time, I would just like to skip and just ask you about Reverend Thero. Like, you were born in Norway in 1964, so you first became interested in Buddhism in your early 20s after a visit to Japan. So what is this turning point? What made you become interested?
It's hard to say. I think I've always been interested in things like, the meaning of life, why we're here, what is the purpose of existence. And I always looked at people and I thought, everyone kind of goes through their life. They study hard at school, they go to university, then they find a partner and get married, they get a job, and then they have 2.5 kids and 1.5 dog and 3/4 of a car or whatever, kind of the average person, right? And I always wonder, what's the point? What is the meaning of all of this? It seems so hollow, so empty, so purposeless. So I was always...
It's all about attachments.
It's all about attachments, and people struggle and people sorrow. They don't really find any real happiness. And even though they don't find happiness, they expect you to do the same.
Yes.
And I thought, what? How can you expect me to do the same when you're not happy? You shouldn't expect me to do the same when you're not happy. So I always had this very inquiring mind. And then I got the opportunity to travel to Japan. I was a student. It was an exchange program. And when I came to Japan, I had this feeling of recognition. I read a book about Buddhism, it had the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, and I recognized all the monasteries. I went to Kyoto, the ancient capital there. I saw some of the monasteries over there. And there was something very familiar about it, And that is kind of when it sort of started with me. And then I came back to Norway, and I was at university, and one of my best friends, he said, here's a book. I said, okay, thank you. He kind of threw me the book. And lo and behold, that book was about breath meditation.
Breath meditation.
Breath meditation, Anapanasati. The most core meditation technique in Buddhism was right there. I have something in my hand.
Buddha practiced
this. This was one of his main meditation techniques according to the suttas. And so then I tried, and I got some good results. And when you have some good results, one thing is the theory, but when you have some good results, that is really transformative. That really changes you. And you start to look at things in a new way. And then I carried on with this. I read more. And eventually I wanted to visit a monastery. And so I went to visit a monastery in the UK. And then I started reading the suttas, the word of the Buddha, because I wanted to read the word of the Buddha. And then I started to think, wow, this is the best stuff I've ever seen. This is really great. This is wonderful. So that is kind of how I ended up as a Buddhist. But there's another reason why I became a Buddhist. Can I just talk? Is that all right? Yeah? Okay. Please stop me if I talk too much. So the other thing which made me a Buddhist, I think, which is actually in one way maybe even more interesting, and that is the fact that I think I was a Buddhist in the past life. Because I look at myself, I look at my childhood, I look at the things that happened to me, and some of those things are really strange. Like when I was a child, I had this fantasy about living in a small hut in the forest by myself. I was only a small child. I want to go out in the forest and live in a hut. Is that okay?
So you love this single, very relaxed life from those days.
Yeah, I don't even know if I thought about it as single and relaxed. I just thought I wanted to live in the forest. I was too young to even understand relaxed or not relaxed. When you're a child, maybe not think in those terms. And so then, but after a few of these kind of, various signs, I thought I must have been a monastic in the past life. And that was kind of scary. Because the moment I knew, and maybe I was a monastic in the past life, the next thought was, well, then that means I'm becoming a monk now out of habit, right? Because I was before. That kind of scared me, because if I'm just becoming a monk out of habit, then is it a good idea or is it a bad idea? That spurred me on to really try to understand Buddhism properly. So I really got into learning the Pali language, being able to read the suttas in the original language, and I've done a lot of translation work as well from Pali into English. And that is when I really became very confident in the suttas, that these suttas, they contain the most profound psychology or philosophy, if you wish, but I call it psychology, in the world. This is really extraordinarily profound. This has to do with the very meaning of life. And then I think this is what people don't get. Buddhism is about the meaning of life. If people understood that this is about the meaning of life, everyone would be a Buddhist. Why isn't everyone a Buddhist? Because we don't get the message out that this is the meaning of life. If people really understood that, everyone, I think, would be a Buddhist. And that's what I got when I read the suttas. It's about the very purpose of existence itself. And this came out of this. So this is kind of how weird kind of things kind of turn, in a sense, around. Yeah.
So that was so inspiring and interesting, I'd say. So in conclusion, Reverend Thera, what are your thoughts on the role that Buddhism can play in promoting peace and understanding in Sri Lanka, where a country with a complex history, I'd say?
It can do a lot to promote peace, Buddhism. And the main way it can promote peace is not so much to try to get the right kind of government, because governments are always going to be unreliable, and people don't go into government because they are Buddhist, because they want to promote Buddhist values. People get into government because they, for all kinds of reasons, some good, some bad, and what have you. But the way to promote peace is always on an individual level. That's the most important thing here. And I was a bit disappointed when I saw the problems in Myanmar and Burma, with the Rohingyas, and people not practicing Buddhist values towards the Rohingyas. The right way, if you feel threatened by somebody as a Buddhist, the wrong way is to kind of try to eliminate them or get rid of them or something like that. If we are threatened as Buddhists, the right way to uphold our teaching is to show that we are above these problems, and we can still be kind, we can still be compassionate, we can still be understanding even though we are threatened. The fastest way to undermine Buddhism is to practice against the Buddhist values, to do things that goes against Buddhism. The things that happen in Burma, I think, in the long run, very detrimental to Buddhism. So we should practice these teachings properly. That is how we uphold these values. That is how we create the best possible societies for ourselves. So it's up to each individual really to do that. And if it is possible to get some people in the government to practice Buddhist values, great. If that can be done, I don't know if that can be done. That will then be a secondary step beyond that.
Yes. So now, since you have come to Sri Lanka for a vacation, is it for a vacation or?
It's for work. Yeah,
for work.
That's why I'm here now, because I'm working.
So, anything that you need to add or give as a message to all the dear listeners of Radio Sri Lanka?
So I would say to everyone, be kind. The most important thing in Buddhism is to be kind. If you can remember this one thing in your life, and of course you will not always remember it, you will forget it from time to time, but come back to this one thing. And if you can practice kindness to the max, then you will be also practicing the Buddhist path really well. You will add to the happiness of the world, you will add to stability and harmony in society, you will be a blessing for yourself and also for everyone else.
Yes, so thank you so much, Reverend Thera Ajahn Rakmali, inspiring your valuable time for a great interview. In fact, inspiring and interesting interview, I'd say. So thank you so much, inspiring your valuable time and agreeing on our interview. And your words and everything was also a blessing for us as well.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
The Coffee Hour. Welcome to Coffee with our morning host. We broadcast a host of programs like current topics, newspaper headlines, and music on Radio Sri Lanka. Tune in every weekday from 7 to 8 a.m.